I am Jonathan Colopy, an executive director with the Y of San Diego County, and this is the Y's Be Well podcast. Our guest today is someone who is exploring whether California can legislate its way to foster greater happiness. It is truly my pleasure to have California Assemblyman Anthony Rendon, Speaker Emeritus, one of our longest serving speakers. Welcome, Anthony. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So you have to share with me, at this point in time, how did you decide to pursue happiness in terms of policymaking this particular year?
Sure. I mean, I've always been interested. I studied philosophy, so I've always been interested in very fundamental questions. What I think of as very stripped down, bare questions. The question of happiness is something that's talked about in philosophy, talked about particularly in ethical philosophy. So I have a little bit of an academic background in the idea of happiness, but it was really a documentary called Happy that I saw on Netflix probably a decade ago that really made me start thinking about the components of happiness, sort of the commonalities across different societies, across different cultures. And I started thinking a lot about that. We work in a place here in Sacramento that the legislature, I think, functions sometimes sort of on standard operating procedures and sort of the way we've always done it before. There's not often a lot of sort of stopping and asking ourselves whether or not we're asking the right questions, whether we're asking fundamental questions. And for me, I think it's ultimately about that desire to ask fundamental questions. Because if you're not asking fundamental questions, you don't know if the answers that you're coming up with are relevant at all to anybody's life.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just that the select committee has taken this on. If I can, Anthony, here's a quote. Happiness is a critically understudied issue in the assembly, one that has the potential to compel us, to have us rethink how and why we create policy in the first place. You were the author of that quote. So thus, this committee has come forward. And as I understand, you've had one meeting or at least you've launched this committee. What may be the chart of work?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not only a question that's been unexplored in California, but quite honestly, in most parts of the United States. I believe this is the first committee of its kind in the U.S. It seems as though other countries are further along, further ahead of us. Within academia in the U.S., there's sort of a growing movement. But if you look at the country, the Principality of Nepal, for example, they have a secretary whose job it is to focus on this issue area. Yeah, we did have our first hearing about a month or so ago where we focused on a lot of the scholarship. I thought it was really important because it's a very fundamental question, because it's a question that we haven't ever talked about. I thought it was important to have sort of a theoretical framework and also a background to show people that, first of all, this is something that the United Nations has looked at for about a quarter of a century. This is something that Oxford University has extensive studies on. So I want to get people up to speed on what's been done in terms of happiness studies. And then that was the first meeting. And then we're having our second meeting tomorrow, where you and I are speaking on Tuesday, the day after Memorial Day. So our hearing will take place tomorrow, Wednesday, the 29th of May. And that hearing will be interesting because in that hearing, we're going to talk about sort of the different stages of our lives. What is happiness about when you're younger? What is happiness about in sort of midlife? What is happiness about when you're older? And I think each of those are very interesting questions. We've seen increases in childhood depression, and I'm sure at your agency you see that a lot. When I was on the UC Board of Trustees and the Cal State UC Board of Regents and the Cal State Board of Trustees, right after COVID in particular, we saw these tremendous spikes in problems relating to mental health. You see these in the community colleges as well. But it also happens at younger and younger ages. Often it happens with bullying. It's been happening a lot with cyberbullying and a lot of the things that happen online and through social media. So I thought it was very important to focus on that age. Also very important, obviously, to focus on older folks. My dad has found himself a widow. My dad and mom were married for 58 years. She died about 3 years ago. He's living alone literally for the first time in his life at 82 years of age. And we've seen places in the municipal government of London actually has significantly invested in efforts to make sure that seniors aren't isolated the way that people like my father have the potential to be isolated at their age and with limited movement and those types of things. So I thought that was a very serious matter that needed to be discussed at that age. Obviously, also you have lots of thoughts about mortality and declining health and those types of things that come into play as well. And then that sort of the middle age is something I've always been interested in as well. I worked in the nonprofit sector for about 20 years. We did gang programs, we did early childhood education programs, but we also did senior programs as well. And there were these moments when I was in the nonprofit sector where I thought this whole vast bulk of our society is sort of in this middle range, not a youth and not older, and we need to make sure that we're providing services for them. So specifically with respect to happiness, I wanted to make sure that we're looking at factors that make or don't make middle-aged folks happy as well.
It's interesting. You've spoken really quickly to the whole continuum. I know during the pandemic, there was a lot of attention on the youth mental health crisis. The Surgeon General declared a crisis. Sure. And then at the same time, as you mentioned a moment ago, on the other end of the continuum, elders, seniors, really during the pandemic were struck by loneliness. They didn't have that opportunity to gather as a community. And so you've spoken to a vast continuum there. And I really appreciate that you're bringing through kind of foundational work for us, laying that groundwork in that context for, okay, this is what's going on in our communities. And then how do we address that? How do we lift up our community and foster, to your point, greater happiness?
Right. Yeah. Thanks for recognizing that. And I feel as though that's always been sort of the problem in my 10 years in the legislature, where we start with the bill idea. We start with trying to solve a problem without identifying either maybe the root of the problem or the best solution to deal with the problem or even what the problem is in and of itself.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Anthony, that there is more discussion about happiness. I took a course online a couple years ago, Dr. Laurie Santos, The Science of Well-Being at Yale. Mm-hmm. And it's, I guess, as I understand, the most popular course there because people are really drawn to learning, how can I be happy? And there's a lot of myths about what we think makes us happy.
There are. It's true. It's true. I think there's two dynamics that I think are really interesting. First of all, you're right. There are a lot of myths about what makes us happy. And then on the other hand as well, it was funny, after I had that first hearing, I talked to different people. And I would say things like, a sense of community, a sense of purpose. And they would say, well, of course. And I thought to myself, well, if it's so easy and so obvious, why are most of us not happy? Why are most of us not pursuing community? Why are most of us not pursuing a sense of purpose? And I think it's again asking these fundamental questions are, I think, the best way of being present, of being mindful, of having, of thinking to ourselves. When you're very mindful, you sort of navigate your day thinking like, okay, I'm going to push that away because that's not really meaningful. I'm going to push that away. Oh, this is important. And I think often in life we can get caught up in stuff that really isn't meaningful and stuff that doesn't really matter.
Yeah. But to your point again, I like what you were sharing that, people in maybe more of a flip way say, well, this makes you happy. Relationships, important relationships, spending time in relationship, being in nature, being grateful, spending time with yourself, living and doing things that are meaningful. Of course, those things make you happy. Right. But to your point, we say it in such a flip way. Do we actually practice that? Do we devote time? You know, we're often on a to-do list of kind of moving along and not being, as you said, being present.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Daniel Siegel, the teaches in the UCLA psychology department. He talks
Yeah.
a lot about that. He talks a lot about mindfulness and the extent to which there's so much that we know that makes us happy that we just don't focus on. We just, like you said, we go to our to-do list, and I think if there's anything I want this happiness committee to do, it's for us to radically rethink our to-do list. Or maybe we don't need a to-do list, but being able to ask those fundamental questions is really, what maybe what I'm trying to do is figure out what goes on the to-do list before we just use yesterday's to-do list all over again.
Exactly. You spoke a little bit earlier about Nepal, and I know many people speak of the country of Bhutan as the happiest country in the world. And I had read that they have a gross national happiness index, and there's certain things that make that up. And I have had friends that have traveled there, and they said they are really struck by people are genuinely happy.
Right, and you do see that in different locales, and I think, for us to be able to identify what makes those happy, what makes those places different, is important in the same way that you can do that with healthcare indicators. I'm a big proponent of comparative models. I always want to know what they're doing in other countries, what they're doing in other states, and I think it's for very similar reasons. We can get caught up in just improving, quote unquote, improving what we have, improving the model that we have. But what if the model we have is not what we should be doing? And I think looking at comparative models is ultimately the best way of doing that.
So what has it been like to bring your colleagues along on this journey so far?
It's been interesting. It's what's fascinating about the topic is in a very partisan charged environment, both in the country and sort of as an institution, it's apolitical. It really has to do with reflection and thinking about what makes all of us happy. And I think that in and of itself has been very interesting because everybody's input is a little similar, but a little bit the same too, which is, I think, the beauty of it. And I think it helps to cut down on a lot of the contention that has existed in the legislature in the past. So it's been great. I have some very, very thoughtful members, and I know you're from San Diego, Marie Waldron from down in San Diego. She's in the northern part of the county. She's on the committee and has been, not only was she a great participant in the first hearing, but she stopped by the office a couple of days after the hearing to have suggestions about subsequent hearings. You talked about nature. Marie thinks we should have one of our hearings outdoors, which is an interesting idea. So yeah, no, it's been great, and having everyone's input has been exciting too.
And I'm actually just fascinated about how you may conduct the meetings itself. You talk about having them outside. I know you're an academic. I know you have a wealth of education. Some of the couple of the things that I've done with my team is often we'll start a meeting with just a meditation, just silencing and quieting ourselves because of that, it's moving from one place to another, meeting to meeting, and you don't allow yourself to kind of center and be present. So that is just such a fascinating shift in energy and just opening up to being in that moment and welcoming whatever that meeting will be. And also we've done meetings outside just walking and having conversation. So you're gathering community. We've done things like just emptying the cup as we start a meeting because maybe something is spilling over from the last meeting or going on. And so emptying out to be present. So I wonder if you're incorporating, it sounds like you may incorporate a meeting in nature, but what other thoughts you might have about the context of your meetings to foster happiness as well?
Yeah, it's a good good thought, a good idea. We don't have anything sort of in the works, but I think it's worth thinking about. I have a background in contemporary art, and I've always been bothered that contemporary art is such a different way of looking at art in a lot of ways, yet so many contemporary art shows are constructed in the same way that traditional art shows are constructed. And I always thought that that doesn't make sense. Let's do it a little bit differently. And I think this is to have that, to make it sort of mimetic of that would be interesting, as well. And it's interesting, you talked about starting meetings with a meditation. I'm very interested in psychology, and one of the things I've been very interested in the past couple of years is transitions. I think transitions are very interesting, and I've noticed when I drop my 4.5-year-old off at school, she has the biggest difficulty with transitions. When she's at school, she's great. When she's at home, she's great, but dropping her off can be really problematic. Picking her up can be really problematic. And I've begun to really focus on those transitions. In my job, you will often have a series of 5, 10, 15-minute meetings, one after the other. And it's very, if you're not cognizant of it, if you're not mindful, it's very easy to be thinking about the last meeting in this meeting. Yeah. I've entered meetings when I'm about a third into the meeting, and I look around the room and I think, who are these people? I know they introduce themselves. Yeah. I have a memo, but I'm thinking about the next meeting. I'm thinking about that last meeting, which ended horribly. So I think transitions are really important, and building in transitions are really important. So I'm glad you're doing that with your staff.
Thank you. Thank you. We're talking about happiness. I saw a statistic or a rating that you gave yourself related to happiness. And whenever I have guests on the program, I ask each guest to share what is important to them. What is a well-being practice that is critical to their well-being? Because we like to learn from one another. And just, I look at yourself and your career, you've done a lot of different things, but important to you, what would be your well-being practice?
Well, it's changed. It's really changed. To me, being alone is very important. It's very important for me to whether I'm reading or writing, or you talked earlier about going for a walk. I mean, I think that's very important as well. I'm married now. I have a child now, both of which came much later in life than they do for a lot of people. Got married in my late 40s and a kid in my mid 50s. And the extent to which those things are so incredibly central to my life is amazing. I was out of town with a few friends this weekend, and I didn't realize that they were counting the number of times I FaceTime my daughter on any given day. Those moments are really important, and I think they help to provide, again, like sort of transitions. I noticed when I was walking into a different restaurant, I would FaceTime her and show her, and you kind of it's an opportunity to kind of bring her along to different places, and having those conversations is important as well.
That's beautiful. So Anthony, how are Californians doing in terms of happiness?
Californians tend to be happier than folks from other states in the U.S. Happiness overall in the United States has decreased in recent years. You look at the recent PPIC numbers. Well, let me back up a little bit. The United States overall, the happiness index scores relative to the rest of the world have decreased in the last 5 to 10 years. Californians have decreased as well. Californians still tend to be a little happier than Americans in general, but that seems to be problems there as well. And again, what makes it, again, people will often have easy answers. They'll say, well, COVID, but no, it's comparative, right? We're talking about everybody all over the world had to deal with COVID. So what is it about Americans? What is it about Californians that is making us relatively less, from a contextual standpoint, what is making us less happy? And I don't know yet. I really don't. That's sort of the part of the journey of this committee, but it's something we're going to look at.
So I'll tease you a little bit further there if I can. Any acting hypothesis as you move into this, or are you just really blank slate? You're level setting at this point?
I think it's kind of a blank slate, kind of level setting. I mean, we do know in general, what we know about happiness studies is, the idea that, there's the idea that, money makes you happy. We know that money doesn't make you happy after a certain point, right?
Yep.
There's not a heck of a lot of difference between the happiness of millionaires versus billionaires, or even upper middle class folks experience. Once you have a certain modicum of income, you can be pretty happy. But we also know that the opposite is not necessarily true, right? I mean, you have to have your basic needs met to an extent.
Yes.
That is interesting because the idea of basic needs is sometimes contextual, right? A sense of what are the basic needs in one place can be comparatively different than they are in other places. I think there are a lot of Californians struggling, particularly around housing and housing insecurity and homelessness. And we know if you have, I mean, as well as I do, when you have that sort of nagging concerns, whether it's your health, whether it's, your economic situation, we know that gets to you. So I think particularly around the housing issue and housing insecurity issue, I think there's a lot of people who are worried.
Yeah, those social determinants of health, as you said, those basic needs in whatever community are critical. That is kind of foundation to then
Absolutely.
having levels of happiness. So Anthony, what would be your call to action for us as Californians as you do this work? How can we support the work that's being done?
I appreciate you asking. I think this is something, I'm glad the California legislature is looking at this. That's great. Universities need to look at it too. Nonprofit organizations such as yours need to look at it. Corporations need to look at it. We all need to take this topic seriously and look at the extent to which in different settings we can be helpful toward assuring that folks are happy. We can make a lot of money. We can buy a house. We can get a job. But if you're not happy, then what's the point of any of it?
Yeah, well, very well said. So Anthony, anything that I haven't asked you that would be important to share with us at this time?
I don't think so. We have a couple more hearings. We'll have a couple more hearings before the end of the year, but I'm really excited about, again, the way we've constructed this. As every hearing will have a little bit of a different focus. And then the comparative model is very important to me. It's important to have people from different states, from different countries. Tomorrow we're going to have a professor from Oxford who's going to talk about happiness, and obviously he has a large sense of different entities throughout the world. So it's I'm proud of the work we're doing, but I'm in my last year here.
I was going to say, Anthony, first off, I want to thank you for serving our communities and serving California. You've spoken several times about transitions, and it's not lost on me that you have a transition for yourself coming up, and I wonder what may be next. Often transitions that you want to appreciate those stages, and so I deflect back to you. What's next in on your journey?
You know what? It's taken me a little while and maybe it's this focus on happiness, but my daughter's has another year before she starts kindergarten, and I think spending next year doing some teaching, and I want to be able to drop her off in the morning and pick her up at her preschool when she gets out. And if I can do that over the course of the next year and a half or 2 years, I think that would make me happy.
That's beautiful. I appreciate that as well. So Anthony, thank you very much for this conversation and the work that you're doing. And I continue to wish you well in your life. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And for all of you, until we're back again, please be well.